Hello, everyone. What would you do with a check for $1,702? No strings attached, no hoops to jump through, just a simple online declaration, and the money's yours. That is the reality this year for every man, woman, and child who lives in the state of Alaska. And though the amount has differed over the years, it has been the reality for Alaskans since 1982. Because of the foresight and dedication of just a few legislators some decades ago, it is a reality that has inspired envy and admiration the world over. Nowhere more so than in the hearts of their neighbors just across the border in Canada. With a landmass smaller than Nunavut, a population approximate to New Brunswick, and an economy roughly the size of Newfoundland and Labrador's, Alaska, by geography, culture, and history, is much more recognizable, familiar even to Canadians than many of our American cousins to the south. For its original inhabitants and all those who came after in pursuit of its furs, its gold, its fisheries, its woods, now its oil and gas, Alaska is the home of immense wealth. Its economic and political history are in many ways the story of that wealth, of those seeking to claim it for themselves and make their riches, of those trying to subsist to feed their families and communities. And long before its admission to the Union and the advent of its statehood, it is the story of how this wealth could be marshaled to fund the apparatus of government, to develop and to make the lives of its citizens better. For those of us on the outside looking in, the path that Alaska has charted for itself can seem almost utopic. No income tax, no sales tax, nearly every metric for individuals. It is the lowest tax jurisdiction in the USA. And still, it has managed to build the largest subnational sovereign wealth fund in the world, the Alaska Permanent Fund. And from it, it pays all of its residents a dividend. Today we ask, is this picture of enlightened government policy as rosy as it seems, or is there something rotten in the state of Alaska? Will those checks come in perpetuity, or will they succumb to the hazards of power in politics? Welcome, everyone, to Commonwealth Canada's inaugural podcast. Here, over the next couple of months, we'll be talking to those from Canada and around the world, as today, who share our mission, who are seeking to recognize, to protect, to expand our Commonwealth, and to ensure that we and the generations to come may all benefit from it. My name is Liam Wilkinson, and I've spent the better part of last year thinking about this exact question in the Canadian context. My colleagues and I, we've all been working to develop the policies and programs that could share the many manifestations of Commonwealth here in Canada. In addition to making models and crunching numbers, I have been personally concerned primarily with the perils and pitfalls of enacting such changes. I've asked myself, if we ever manage to enact a Commonwealth, to give every resident of Canada their share, what risks would that face? Who would be the detractors of such a program? What would be its downfall? How could we set it up in order to minimize that risk and ensure its longevity? In other words, what might we learn from the example of Alaska? So in this very first episode of the Commonwealth podcast, I could not be more privileged than to be joined by two men who are tackling those problems in the Alaskan context right now, Dr. Jack Hickel and Mr. Rick Halford. Dr. Hickel is a man who has lived by the value of service, whether he is sharing his talents as a physician in Alaska's many underserved Native communities, or combating food insecurity or TB in the too often forgotten corners of South Sudan, particularly at the moment. Through his long career, Dr. Hickel has demonstrated that life's many blessings and riches are best when they're shared. He joins me today as a defender of the Alaska Permanent Fund. My second guest, Mr. Rick Halford, knows that sharing is not merely about giving everyone an equal slice of the pie today. To truly share, we must think of the generations to come, to conserve our shared wealth for them. As commercial pilot over Alaska's skies, he's seen more of the state's natural wealth than most. As a legislator of nearly 25 years, including as the Senate President and Majority Leader, he's voted time and time again to use that wealth responsibly. And as a hunter and outdoorsman, he knows intimately what it means to steward the bounty of nature for those to come. So, gentlemen, Thank you ever so much for being with us today, for talking with us. We've got a lot to cover. We want to know what is this permanent fund? How does it work? Where does it come from? What's threatening it? How did we get here today? But before we get to all that, I want to ask each of you in turn, how did you get here today? How did you come to this current work through your storied careers, through your advocacy? How did you come to being so outspoken and advocating for the protection of the permanent fund? Perhaps, Dr. Hickel, I'll direct the question to you first.
Thank you, Liam. That was a great introduction to what we're trying to accomplish. I'm a physician, recently retired. Spent most of my professional career has been in Africa, in Eswatini. Currently have a project in South Sudan with fighting food insecurity and providing clean water, and built a couple of medical clinics. In my many, many years in Africa, I have seen poor people living on rich lands, people with oil underneath their huts dying of starvation. And this is totally unacceptable to me, and it should be unacceptable to mankind as well. My father, Walter Hickel, the former governor of Alaska, had a strong belief in the commons and the permanent fund. And he's the one that brought a lot of this passion to me based on his vision for the commons in Alaska. I'm currently on the board of the Institute of the North, which researches and advocates for the management of the commons for the maximum benefit of the people.
Thank you very much. Rick, what about yourself? What brought you here?
I would have to say 50 plus years of experience from starting in the wrong direction. I think most of us learn in life from our mistakes. And certainly, I came out of the front end of an airplane and went into the legislature some 40 years ago. And I had some of the same views that I today think are the wrong direction in terms of, what you see in the political process is often an effort to privatize public resources. And we have amazing capacity to rationalize our self-interest, and that works through the process. The process teaches and rewards manipulation. It rewards things that are much more short-term than long-term. If there's any difficulty with democracy, it's not that it's not the best there is, but the problem is that it way overrepresents the present and underrepresents the future. And you don't learn that until you watch it, you make mistakes, and some of those mistakes are at public expense over the years. But in that process, I realize that we do the best we can protect the future, often against the greed and the perceived need of the present. And Alaska was presented with a unique opportunity. I mean, a tiny population, a huge windfall, and a public that was willing to try and save that money. We tried to set up a system that worked to do that. At the time we passed the first final constitutional dividend, after all the debate and everything else, I was the majority leader of the House. And I believe that was a very, very good step. As we've seen since then, in terms of the attacks against it and the attacks on the fund itself, it wasn't a perfect step. Nothing that we can think of 40 years ago and evaluate today is going to be a perfect step, but it's something worth protecting, and it has been a part of the character of Alaska for 40 years. It is truly something that equalizes a lot of the power structure and all the rewards of a political system, which is driven by power, influence, experience, position, and often age. And this system has helped Alaska not follow most of the rest of the nation in the gap between rich and poor. And it also is part of the understanding that the resources that this fund is based on are public resources. And every Alaskan, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're at the top or the bottom of the economic spectrum, is an owner of these resources in an equal share.
So that is that is a shift in consciousness. I think that when we try and share this with people, that is one of the hardest things to bring people to come to realize. If they do realize it, all the policies that we'd advocate and stewarding this wealth and sharing in this wealth, all that follows. But the thing you pointed to, this idea that we are all owners in this wealth, is what, in our experience, has been the hardest thing to share with people. So take us back all the way back to the beginning of the fund, before this was written into the state constitution. You said that there's always in politics, there's always the pressures of the short term and front ending and thinking about the concerns of today. So who was it? Who were the people in the room that had the bright idea to initially start putting this money aside, to save it for a rainy day, to put it away for hard times? And this and in doing so, this idea that you spoke of that it was a shared wealth. It was the shared ownership of all Alaskans. It did exist at the time it was being first introduced.
I'll let Rick address some of that. I'd just like to make the point that you'll never sell the idea of a permanent fund and a dividend until people understand that the commons are natural resources. It's different than private property. This is common property. Nature put the forests, the mining, the oil for everybody to benefit from. This is not private property. It's common property. The forest to build homes, the iron to make tools, the fish to feed themselves. And people need to understand that. The oil does not belong to the oil companies. It belongs to the people. They did not put the oil in the soil. You got to sell that idea to every generation forever for them to understand that, so they'll buy into the idea of the commons. But I'll address the history a little bit.
Well, when the North Slope sale occurred in 1969, the state of Alaska got $900 million. The budget of the state, the whole budget of the state, was something like $120 million the year before that. So a huge, huge windfall came to a scattered population that was economically challenged, had huge costs of service, and a very small economic base, mostly military and very, very minimal tourism developed by that time. So we had an incredible windfall. And the response to that windfall was to try and catch up. And in trying to catch up too fast, the process was, in a simple sense, pretty wasteful. You can't grow that fast. You can't meet those needs. So the $900 million was spent with good intention to try and bring safe water to villages and all kinds of other things, transportation, infrastructure, education, all the things that government does. But that was the situation we started with. The sense of who owns the resources, if it's a renewable resource, the next generation, if you manage it properly, it's going to be there. If it's a non-renewable resource, it should be the property of all generations of Alaskans, or all generations of any population that is sitting on those resources. The permanent fund, we were liquidating resources that were beyond the imagination of any other oil field in North America. And it wasn't going to grow back. It wasn't going to be something else. So the public, in seeing that reaction, kind of developed a consensus that we should save at least some of that wealth, because generations in the future, when the non-renewable resources were gone, we're still going to have to educate kids in little tiny communities, hundreds of miles apart, with no surface transportation, no medical, no services. I mean, none of the things could happen without some carrying forward of that benefit. But Jack's dad wrote a whole really owner state memo book and all the pieces in a collective way, that the state had a different responsibility, not just to be a regulator, not just to be a keeper of the peace, but to be an owner. And I think another leader that came behind him and kind of personalized that to individuals was Jay Hammond. They came at the same problem from opposite directions, but they were giants in the development of the attitudes. Another person that was one of the leading bankers in Alaska at the time, Elmer Rasmussen, had a great deal of ideas, education, and concern, because in areas where you have massive resource wealth, it usually takes over the economy, takes over everything, including private banking, which was his experience. And he tried to help both sides of that equation that were coming from the owner state, from the stockholder state, and there was no real consensus on what should happen with the money. But there was an overwhelming consensus in the population that we should pass a constitutional amendment to save at least a portion of that non-renewable wealth in a permanent fund. That passed in 1976. And for the next 4 years, there was serious debate, argument, and so forth as to what to do with the fund. And of course, we all have the ability to consider the things we want to spend money on as investments, and the things somebody else wants to spend money on is just spending. So the first thing that happened was a major battle over making it a huge loan fund. The battle over creating the permanent fund dividend, the battle over the conditions of the permanent fund dividend, because the permanent fund dividend is intended to actually make the impact at the bottom of the scale, not just the top of the scale. The wealth of government usually is allocated by the power structure of government. We want it to feed the bottom end of that. So we included children in receiving the permanent fund dividend. That went against the whole age difference in terms of economy. The other thing we did is we put what we called a welfare hold harmless in that didn't allow the receipt of the dividend to take people off of a beneficial role that they were on because of the rest of their economic condition. But those were major battles to create the permanent fund dividend. There was a number of court cases about differential residency, which failed, and the final dividend was passed in 1982. I was a fairly new legislator, but by that time I was the majority leader of the House when we passed the dividend that is on the books today.
I definitely want to talk a little bit more about some of those battles and just how the dividend portion of it came to be. But if you would, I want to circle back to the constitutional amendment that started this, the very idea and intuition that some of this should be put away. And I think, you described the North Shore sale and this windfall of cash, and government starts spending and building schools and bringing clean water projects. And there's something about the character of Alaskans. There's something about Governor Hammond. There's something, Jack, about your dad that makes them go, hang on a sec, I think we should be putting some of this away. I'm grown up in a different age of politics, but that seems like a rarity nowadays. What do you think it was about the character of these people or the citizens of Alaska that gave them that intuition?
I think people that come to Alaska, especially in those years, were pioneers. They came up not to use a system, but to create a system. It was a new state. From that standpoint, it hadn't been developed, and people came up with dreams, big dreams, to make the right things happen. Not just to make money. Of course, everybody likes to make money, but it was to make Alaska great. And they saw that the huge oil wealth that we now had could make us great, but we had to manage it appropriately. And for them to come up with the idea of the permanent fund and then to put it in our Constitution so it couldn't be touched, at least the principle of that was magical. It was very, very, down the road sort of vision. So they were pioneers. They were very interesting sort of people.
Yeah, and that just seems like such a rarity to me, a specific moment in time. I think about the challenges of politics. You can often convince people to do something with money if the cause is worthy enough. But to convince people to set the money aside, to not touch it, without even having yet decided, with taking another 5-10 years and a lot of argument over what to spend the money on, It just seems like a remarkable accomplishment for the leaders of the day. You said, Jack, that your dad published a call to arms, if you will, an expression of this vision that motivated people. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, he actually wrote 2 books. The first one he wrote after he was Secretary of the Interior under Nixon. That was called Who Owns America? The title itself says the story, doesn't it? Who owns America? It's not the capitalists, it's the people own America. And then he wrote The Crisis in the Commons after he was governor the second time, because he saw what opportunities we have here in Alaska for being a model for the world. After he came to visit me in Africa for 3 times, he's the one that said, my gosh, Jack, what is going on with this world? African nations are resource rich, but look at the conditions they're living in. And when he saw that, he came home and he says, we have got riches here and we're using it the right way to save it for the future instead of letting the oil companies just rape us. We're a resource colony initially, weren't we? Suffering from kind of a resource curse. He saw that our model could be a model for the world, a beacon of hope in a world of poverty. That if you use the resources for the maximum benefit of the people, there would be no legitimate reason for poverty on this planet. And if you look at that, if you run the numbers, and some economists have, say, if the resources, the oil, the gas, the timber, the fish, the mining, space, cyber, excellent, all those things, if you use that for the max benefit of the people, there would be a huge impact on poverty that would change the world. People would have, basically, you'd be able to address that royalty wealth and the interest earnings wealth from the savings in a permanent fund to address the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, addressing hunger, education, poverty, inequality. It's amazing what we could do with this model. And that's why they move forward with this.
Reading a little bit about the history of Alaska in preparation for this call, it is kind of surprising that such a consensus grew out of the state. I was reading that since its purchase from the Tsar way back in the 1800s, right from day one, Alaska as a territory had a really difficult time of raising any money in terms of taxation revenue at all. It was the home of, and every time that a governor or the legislature tried to raise some sort of revenue, the salmon canneries or the logger barons or the mining consortiums would get together and effectively kill it. And this reputation as a low tax haven, as a place where you could go and take from nature freely and give very little back in terms of repaying the commons through taxation, that attitude kind of ossified. It became a draw for many people. So what was it then that about the figures at the time, given this history, this kind of the cultural draw that Alaska had at the time, that enabled its leaders to get its people to not just pass a bit of legislation or win an election, but to pass a constitutional amendment to enshrine this value that, no, we're going to save this, it belongs to us all, and we're not going to waste it.
But you have to go back to the comparison of the $900 million check and the $120 million budget, and the fact that the $900 million was gone in 5 or 6 years. And, that really galvanized the concern in the general public. And it wasn't that it was all wasted. It's just that you can't grow that fast. You can't meet those needs that fast without a lot of mistakes. But those mistakes drove an awful lot of it. The permanent fund dividend, the permanent fund creation was opposed by the oil industry, was opposed by a number of the entities that thought, well, if we can spend this money, we'll never have to pay taxes. We did have income taxes in those days. We had an income tax until I think 1980 or 1981, and a lot of money was flowing. Remember that the permanent fund was built at 25% of the income from royalties and non-renewable resources. So we had the rest of the money. So a lot of the loan programs and other things were funded otherwise while we built the permanent fund system, and that was a big help. Having industrial development loan program, having a housing loan program. Outside of that, we were still the recipients of a huge amount of money from the greatest oil field in North American history. And we're proud of the savings in the permanent fund, but we should also not be so proud of the level of the spending and how fast it went. A lot of it was good. But you make mistakes, and the first step to learning from your mistakes is not to hide them, but to admit them.
And so the government does, the people do, people recognize maybe we went a bit too fast, too soon. We're going to start putting some money away. The constitutional amendment is passed. Take us back to these, the fights that you alluded to earlier about now you got a bunch of people, well, not so much people, but a community of people now got to figure out how to spend this money. What were the competing interests, and how is it that a dividend finally won out?
Well, I would say the competing interests were the same as they are in any economy. I mean, they're all the services that government can provide, the security that government can provide. The loan programs were the first one to kind of surface. And they surfaced often by the people who opposed the creation of the permanent fund. But then they wanted to say, well, now we need to loan money to build all this stuff. And, sadly, when you have too much money, your liberal friends talk about some human need that you've got to meet. And what they're really saying is they've got some friends that want to be the executive director of a new program. And your conservative friends talk about you got to build infrastructure. But what they're trying to do is get the state to build a road to the homestead they're trying to sell. And, that's just, again, our own human nature. But that's why democracies have such a terrible time in saving money. But we had a different thing than you have in thinking of it going forward. You have to figure out how to get the money to save it. We had the money, and it was already collected. It's not like you're collectivizing from the private sector into a socialist scheme, or taking the public sector into a private scheme. We already had it. It was set up. It was set up by our Constitution. The money was public, and it was genuinely surplus to what we could reasonably spend in that time frame. And that was a big help in getting there. To try and do that the other way around, to have to take it from somebody to save it, democracy is going to have a very difficult time reaching those decisions.
The theme that we've heard with past guests before, this idea of redistribution versus redistribution. Once it finds its way into the corners, into private hands, once it manifests as private capital, it's very hard to then redistribute it after the fact. But if you've collected it ahead of the fact, the conversation gets a little bit easier. But it's an interesting point you raised, though, about the differences between our two countries, because I was looking today at a portion of taxes that are collected on a barrel of oil on the North Shore or in Alberta. And I've learned that Canada collects almost twice as much tax revenue on that barrel of oil. Yet still, if you look at potentially a comparable jurisdiction, the province of Alberta, if you look at their oil reserves, and albeit it's a little harder to get out of the ground and sell in Alberta, but we see that we're collecting more money, yet we have a lot less left over, and debatably less direct benefit to its citizens. So it's quite the remarkable story, you say, that comes as a function of the windfall. Sorry, Jack, I see you. Is the fellow you want to add?
It's interesting. What Rick says is very true. We were very fortunate. But that doesn't mean that this model can't be taken to Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, whatever. It can't be taken. It can be taken to the world. All you have to do is, again, you have to convince the people that the resources belong to them, not to the oil companies. And you've got to get that into their minds and totally believe that the commons is their money. Then you can start taking some of that oil wealth and putting some into a permanent fund or a sovereign wealth fund. But you have to start doing that first. It's interesting. We have a vision for taking our owner state model, our permanent fund dividend program, to the world. And what we're looking at are taking it to the resource rich but impoverished nations of the world. We've taken it to South Africa, Uganda, Sudan, South Sudan. Iraq was interested in, Mongolia's been interested in. But if you start with some of these countries that are now writing or rewriting their constitutions, i.e. Chile and South Sudan, my son and I and some others went to South Sudan, which is that Sudan at that time, and promoted this idea at the highest levels. And in the South Sudan Constitution, it almost parallels what we have in our Constitution. The resources are owned in common for the maximum benefit of the people and be safe for current and all generations. So we can get that idea out there. This is not a model that's stuck in Alaska. This is a model that can go to the world. And even in the developed countries, you have to convince people that the resources are theirs and they need to take that wealth. The people that don't like the dividend are the rich people and the corporations. They want the dividend money spent on government services so they don't have to pay taxes. The people that benefit from the dividend are the poorer people. But the rich people couldn't care about that. They want no taxes, so let's spend the dividend on government. That's another quantum leap that the countries have to take. That the dividend belongs to all people equal. The resources belong to all people equal, and the only way to do that is a dividend.
Did this consciousness, this understanding that the oil revenues were the common property of all Alaskans at the time, did that exist in a meaningful shared understanding before the dividend was passed, or is that, in a way, a product of the dividend?
A little bit of history. Maybe I'm going to get off on a tangent a little bit here. Sorry, Rick. But the commons has always been historically belonged to the people. People had places to graze their sheep and places to grow their gardens. And the enclosure movement in England and in Europe took those lands, put a fence around it, and claimed it for themselves and started charging the formal landowners and the agricultural people and the shepherds, started charging them to use their own land because they put a fence around it and claimed it to be their own. So the idea of the commons is much older than the idea of private ownership of resources. We just need to get that idea back into the consciousness of mankind.
But your question about, why did it come up? I mean, you had Walter Hickel, who was a charismatic leader. You had Jay Hammond, who was a charismatic leader. They had opposite initial starting points, but they both believed that it was the commons, and they did describe it in that term at that time. But it was the property of Alaska, and one had a stronger development bent, one had a stronger conservation bent. But what they agreed on was that you shouldn't let somebody steal
it. It is a unifying thought, and not let someone else come and take what rightfully belongs to you. So the dividend is then eventually passed, and people start, there's a few years of savings that happen. Eventually the dividend start rolling out to people. Take us through give us the Coles notes and bring us up to today. How did it work? How did people's attitudes change? And when did these emerging risks that we alluded to in the intro, when did they start emerging?
The structure, the way it's set up, needs to be understood. The permanent fund has two accounts. You have a principal account, which is the non-spendable account, and you have the earnings reserve account, which is the spendable account. So all the earnings of 25% royalties, in reality, it's about 12.5% goes into the permanent fund when you look at all the structure. But the royalty went into the permanent fund. It comes out as investment earnings, which goes into the earnings reserve account. The ERA, the earnings reserve account, initially was only to pay a dividend and inflation-proof the fund and fold some of the money back into the principal to grow the permanent fund. That worked really well until the state started running out of money. They had already spent down their constitutional budget reserve, which is a savings account, which was established to be a cushion for the times when the permanent fund was struggling a bit. Well, they already spent down of that $16 billion account. We've already spent over $13 billion of that. And then to try to balance the budget, then they started taking money from the earnings reserve account, giving it to government services, and then they started cutting the dividend. And it's just this steamrolling waterfall of spending money unwisely sometimes and not replenishing what they're doing. Sometimes they weren't inflation proofing. They're spending down the earnings reserve account. They weren't folding it back into the principal. And the value of the fund has actually decreased over the years, over these past 10 years.
Let's get a little bit more clear about that. So the constitutional amendment says we're going to put a set amount of this money aside. This money goes into a fund, and that fund, the idea is the principal can't be touched, but what it earns as investment income, that can then be distributed to citizens of Alaska in the form of a dividend.
Yes.
Or spent.
Or spent.
Or spent.
Or spent by government.
And therein lies the rub, yeah.
And initially, the government wasn't getting any of the ERA monies. It was just for dividend and inflation proofing, et cetera. But in 2016, I think it was, maybe it was 2014, they started taking some of the earnings reserve because the price of oil had plummeted. So now they're taking some of that money. The earnings reserve account is not in the Constitution. It is not protected. Any amount, the entire ERA could be spent with a simple majority vote of the legislature. And that is the problem that we're running into now. The earnings reserve account, according to the Permanent Fund Corporation, the Board of Trustees, said this year that the ERA could be spent and gone in the next 3 to 5 years. If that happens, then where's the government going to get their money? Is there going to be a dividend? Probably not. So that's the battle going on now. What do we do with the earnings reserve account? What do we do with the dividend? Everybody's fighting over that money. What direction are we going?
There's a key element there that survived and protected the permanent fund for decades, and that is that the permanent fund dividend, and the reason for the earnings reserve account was because the permanent fund dividend was paid on a 5-year average of the income. So it had to have an account from which to come from. So the earnings went in there, and this account built up. And when it built up a lot, we put major appropriations from that account back to the principal on numerous occasions to keep the fund going. But the bottom line was the connection between the dividend and the permanent fund was in a statute. That statute was authorized by the language of the constitutional amendment, which said the income goes to the general fund unless otherwise provided by law. So the otherwise law provided for a dividend that was based on basically 1/2 of the 5-year average income of the fund. So it was tied together. And every fall, an elementary school kid would announce what the dividend was going to be based on the performance of the fund. That fact and that connection protected the fund from unwise management decisions. It protected the fund from appropriation for other purposes. It protected the fund. Well, a governor who was allowing more to go out in oil tax credits than went in the whole permanent fund dividend for that year, actually vetoed half of the appropriation. And then there was a court case as to whether it had to be appropriated or whether the language in the Constitution, as otherwise provided by law, could dedicate the funds to the permanent fund dividend. That law lost in a constitutional case. It was decided by a judge who'd probably been in elementary school when we did it, and we ended up losing that piece of the protection. If the dividend and the fund itself were still connected, we wouldn't have the things we have today in terms of questionable management, investment structures, and board action. And there's a lot of things that were protected by the dividend. The two major things that really made the permanent fund so successful were Number one, it had inflation proofing, and probably the primary sponsor of that and the person who worked on it the most was Elmer Rasmussen. And it had a dividend that was connected by formula to the fund, and that was Hammond's piece of the puzzle that made it work. None of us knew what was going to happen. None of us knew how big it was going to be. There were there were a lot of legislators, a lot of people who worked very hard to make this all happen. But it was also good fortune and a situation that was unique that set it up. And it lasted 30 years. And by the time it went to a court that is appropriate, has to deal with appropriations and lives by appropriation, an executive branch that lives by appropriation, and a legislature that believes a whole lot of their exercise of their authority is appropriation. So the appropriation provision of the permanent fund that didn't require that to happen lost in that mix. And now the amount of the dividend is set politically by a battle amongst all those interests. But what's sad to realize is that whether you're liberal or conservative, it doesn't seem that equality is its own greatest reward. To some, the equal is not regressive enough, and to others, equal is not progressive enough. And the system in its simplicity, when it was connected, worked very well. Now it needs repair.
Let's get into that, because I think we're well into the weeds and the mechanics. And I think this is often one of the reasons that the simplicity of this idea that it's yours and that we should save some of it and that you should have a direct hand in it. I think complexity is where a lot of citizens check out, where a lot of the business of politics can conflate and confuse things. What would be needed to repair it? And perhaps as an addendum to that, how is this debate currently being understood by the average Alaskan who is waiting for their check? Are they following this? Do they still feel that spirit of a fixed amount should be saved for a rainy day? Or as a lot of the detractors say, no, the pressure of the body politic to just maximize the benefit today, will win out. It's often the death of programs like this.
It's interesting. I think the general public, they love the idea of the dividend. Whether all of them understand that it's actually coming from the commons and not from a generous government, that's, again, back to the education piece. But the people love the dividend. The original dividend back in 82 was $1,000. And if you were to cover that with inflation and add inflation, that the current dividend would be $3,500. Well, this year they got $1,700. They realize their dividend is half of what it should be. They know that. Governor Dunleavy proposed a dividend, I believe, at $3,500, which would be the statutory formula. So the people are aware of this. Do they have the power to change the legislators' opinions? Again, that's a battle, because the legislators, like most of them do, they want to spend money that they can get. Everybody's afraid of the T word. All the legislators are afraid of the tax word because they think they're not going to be elected again. But a lot of them don't want a dividend. Some of them do, but it's about looking at what the benefit of the dividend is. Once people realize how it benefits the economy more than government spending, people tend to change their mind. The Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska showed that cutting the dividend is the worst thing you can do for the overall economy. Cutting the dividend is worse than reducing the number of state workers. It's worse than cutting dividend is worse than reducing capital spending or broad-based spending cuts. The dividend is $1 spent by the government circles the economy 1.5 times. $1 spent of the permanent fund dividend by the owner of that money, the citizen, cycles the economy 4 times. So The dividend is the way to fight a recession. Getting rid of the dividend is a regressive tax. So this is stuff we need to really push forth with our legislators, because they forget that the dividend is beneficial to the economy, not just to the individual person. Before the dividend, Alaska had the greatest income inequality. After the dividend, greatest income inequality amongst all the 50 states. After the dividend, we had the least income inequality. That's shifting a little bit now, but it just shows how the dividend works.
Yeah, I think that is one of the reasons why so many around the world hold up the Alaska dividend as just the shining example, the city on the hill of what can be accomplished, and how it acts as a basic income, how it supports people's basic needs, and how that money cycles through the economy so many times. So with all these benefits, why and this consensus and this idea that was there from the beginning that this is coming from petroleum wealth that we all own collectively, where in this conversation is the idea to capture more of it, to capture more of the petroleum wealth? If Alaska has some of the lowest taxes on oil in all 50 states, and the United States has some of the lowest in the world, does that feature into the discussion for the average Alaskan?
The sad part is that money figures into the discussion. And in the selection of the Alaska legislature, in the selection of the governor, in the selection of the leadership, money and campaigns are very heavily influenced by those who have the most of it and have the most to gain. So essentially, the industry has a huge influence on who decides what their taxes are and who decides whether they're going to get tax credits or whether it's going to go to individuals and dividends. And they have successfully convinced a lot of people that the numbers are clear. You know, our rate of return for the public resources from the oil and gas industry is lower than everybody else's. But the industry has convinced everyone, and you know, we have eventually gotten to the point where we look at corporations as something different than they are. A corporation is a combine that is designed to build wealth and share it with its shareholders. A corporation can't spend money on anything unless it is to the benefit of its shareholders. It's the duty of the corporations to minimize their expenditures in Alaska, to maximize their profits and maximize their dividends to people who mostly don't come from Alaska. So we have to realize that the political system is very much influenced by those who would pay the taxes. And that's the battle you have up and down the whole argument over, feed the grassroots or use the trickle-down theory. Well, the trickle-down theory, basically the trickling doesn't work, because if you give the same amount of money to a person with a lot of money versus somebody who has to spend it all to survive, you have much smaller impact on the economy. And that's why the dividend works. The dividend feeds the grassroots. The dividend, you can calculate how much came out of every little tiny village by just the population and the amount of the dividend. So a decision to pay a tax credit to the oil industry for the shareholders worldwide versus a decision to cut the dividend in a community of a few hundred people takes tens of thousands of dollars out of that community. And it's real dollars, and it's calculable. It's economic reality. But we tend to think of corporations not as what their economic duty is, what corporate law says they have to do, but we personalize them, and they spend a great deal of money trying to personalize themselves. And it works.
You know, if you decrease the dividend by $1,000, you push 12,000 to 25,000 people below the poverty line. That doesn't sound like a lot of people to you, but we have a very small population up here. And as soon as you take away that $1,000, a lot of people slip below the poverty line. It's tragic.
So the potential is enormous. The risks of getting this wrong and the risks of political fights killing the fund are incalculable. What is the solution to fixing this, or to ensuring that doesn't become the political football, doesn't become the fight that it is? How do you, the name of the organization, the Permanent Fund Defenders? What does an effective defense of the fund look like?
The only really effective defense is a constitutional amendment. And I would say that that is something that you need to consider as you try to build something. If you build something that can be changed by a simple majority in a time of shortage or perceived shortage, you will be in the same situation that we are. We thought we had an ironclad system because there were 4 words in the constitutional amendment that said, unless otherwise provided by law. Our Supreme Court decided those words were meaningless and that it had to be appropriated. Then it was subject to the whole political process and all the competing appropriations. But so for us, you have to go back to the Constitution. And to get back to the Constitution, people have to realize that it's their resource. And it's not just an economic issue. It's also a conservation issue. It's an environmental issue, because the decision to develop or not develop public resources, the decision to privatize public resources, which is what a huge portion of our population lives on, is trying to privatize public resources, is a decision everybody should be involved in. It's not just about, it's simpler in Alaska because it's about a permanent fund and it's a savings account. But the savings account is based on common property resources, and people need to be involved in those decisions. One of the things that I'm sad to see in Alaska is so many conservation friends don't understand that the permanent funds is just the example of all the other resources that are being privatized away from the general public.
I think, go ahead, Liam.
No, please.
I was just going to say, the way we can begin to save our system here is to make a constitutional amendment to fold the ERA, the Earnings Reserve Account, into the principal. That takes that spendable account away from the legislators that could empty out that account by a simple majority. So you put it into the principal. The other thing you do is, right now there's a 5% draw on the interest earnings. That's too high. I think most economists say it should be 4 to 4.25%. We need to drop that 5% to a 4% and put that into the Constitution. So you got to get, like Rick was just saying, you got to get this stuff in the Constitution, or the people are going to steal it. I mean, the legislators are going to steal it for their pet projects. The corporations are going to steal it, try to get that money for their own corporations. So those are 2 steps that we need to take. We need to take that very, very quick before that ERA is gone.
And what about the other ideas? So, the model that you're looking to share with countries around the world who can set up similar things, who have other resource profiles. Is there any discussion of any movements to apply different resource revenues as inputs into the fund?
Well, and we should be discussing that here. I don't mean to monopolize this, Rick, but we should be discussing this here, because right now about the only thing that goes in a permanent fund is oil wealth. But we have minerals, we have fish, we used to have timber. All that wealth should be put into the permanent fund because they're all part of the commons. If you put all the royalty wealth, 100% of the royalty wealth of 100% of our natural resources, we would grow that permanent fund pretty quickly to a point where it would fund government services and a reasonable dividend and inflation improvement. So that's really where we need to go. All the commons, all the royalties from those commons need to go into the permanent fund. Then the government eventually will get enough to spend out of that earnings, where they can claw back what they need for taxation, but they would get the people's permission to claw that back because it's our money.
Yeah, and I think that is, therein lies the crux. It's finding the way in which to convince people that it is theirs, that they do own it, that it is their property. I think there's a split a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Whenever we spent some time now talking about, in Commonwealth Canada, we talk about dividends, we talk about basic income in our previous manifestation as UP at Work. We spend years advocating for basic income for many of the reasons that you spoke about, for its ability to alleviate poverty, for its efficacy as an economic multiple. But whenever you talk to anyone around the world, there'll come a point in the conversation where someone will say, well, Alaska has it. It's kind of viewed as the values in action, as the shining example of a program and how well it can work. And it is the constant rebuttal to anyone who says, well, it's a communist thing or it's a socialist utopia. Well, Alaska's got it. So given all this kind of international fawning, which I'm sure you've heard over the years, what do we get wrong about it? What do we get wrong about how Alaskans see the fund, about how it works?
It's interesting when people talk about, socialism versus privatization, and you're trying to move public resources to one side or the other. It looks like in the real economic impact that we have socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. And that's the opposite of the way they would try to say it. But the fact is that the resources started out in public ownership, particularly in the case of Alaska. It was public resources that have made the wealth in Alaska. And is there a reasonable share staying in the state, going to the people of the state? It comes back to Jack's example. Worldwide, there are incredibly rich places with people starving to death. And that's wrong.
Be a simple fact that bears repeating time and time again. Before we kind of close this out, I wanted to return to something that Rick, you said right in your intro, which is, you're the product of experience, you're the product of learning and changing and evolving your mind. I wonder, was there anything about this particular evolution of the permanent fund and its and the many fights that were had over it that changed your mind? Can you call to mind any time that you actually changed your position on something like that? And,
well,
maybe is there a way for us to learn from that in changing the minds we need to over here?
Actually, it's taken me way too long to realize this, but we learn the most from people that we often think are our opponents, because we have to justify. If I can't win the explanation to a member of the press, it's not the press that's my enemy. It's that I've lost the argument, and I need to think about that and learn from it. And, we tend to, as human beings, we hide our mistakes. And when we hide them, we don't take them apart and learn from them. So as I've gotten older, I've realized that, there's lots of things that you do that you learn from. We learn the most from our mistakes. We learn the most from our critics. And we love our allies and our friends. But if I were thanking people for the knowledge that I've collected, it's often thanking people that I disagreed with. And in hindsight, I wish they had won the argument. But as you apply that to the permanent fund, we thought we had it clear enough that we didn't have to go through the constitutional case, and we wouldn't have lost it. No other governor had ever thought they could do that. And some of them wanted to, but we had a governor that did it, and a court system that went along, and a legislature that went along. And again, the whole system operates by appropriation. So they had a little bit of a vested interest in that outcome. Government protects itself. And sadly, sometimes it protects itself against the clearly stated interest and expression of its voters. And, 15 years before that, they'd put an issue on the ballot: should the income of the permanent fund, some of it, be used for government? And only 15% of the voters that voted on it agreed with it. Once they had spent a lot of money and a lot of things, they succeeded in making the permanent fund everyone's backup choice in case they were going to lose their most important appropriation. So if you were very deeply involved in education and education needs, or university needs, or whatever the purpose was, you would say you can cut anything. The starting statement would be the permanent fund is the last thing that should be cut because of what it does to the economy, because of what it does to the poor, because of its overall effect. But if you're going to cut the one thing that I hold the most dear, then maybe I'll have to go along with cutting the permanent fund. Well, collectivizing that system in a legislative process makes the permanent fund the fallback for virtually everybody. You can, instead of paying taxes today, the only tax that anybody likes is a tax on somebody else. But the fact is, going after the permanent fund is a tax on your children and your grandchildren, because the non-renewable resources won't be there, and will still be a place with tremendous transportation costs, tremendous energy costs, a scattered population, and a lot of human need without infrastructure. But the next generation won't have the massive wealth that we've had and given back and given away to essentially interests that are privatizing public wealth.
Yeah. Makes me think, sometimes I'm being on the other side of this, trying to get it started from the ground. I think I can't wait for the day where we get this done, where we enact this in law, and then we can, put up our feet and call it a day. But I think what you're sharing is making me realize that if the other interests that be are always going to be trying to find ways to read the law differently or find a way to privatize that wealth, that the necessity for advocating and for sharing and educating with people that this wealth is public and that it should be protected and it should be conserved and passed down, that work will unfortunately never be over. On that note, maybe I want to ask I want to end on maybe a cliche. So we have every confidence that the permanent fund defenders are going to win this present battle. That, let's say that the constitutional amendment is passed, and like you said, the earnings fund and the principal fund are rolled in together. The amount that can be drawn upon is reduced. I want you to imagine what this program looks like 100 years from now. What does it look like when the oil runs dry, or the price of oil goes to zero? The world is electrified. Imagine for me, if you will, how you see a permanent fund a couple generations from now.
If we could grow our permanent fund to roughly 150 billion, then the government could support itself indefinitely, pay a dividend, et cetera, basic needs to be taken care of. I think we can get there, but we just need to do the things we just talked about, putting things in a constitutional amendment, getting the wealth resources, the royalty wealth from all natural resources. Way down the road, 100 years from now, my father had a vision. He said that the nations of the world approached the United Nations to establish a global commission on the commons to set the rents and royalties of those nations that are developing the resource wealth. So this would be determined by a UN commission to help these nations that are struggling with trying to get the resource wealth to set the proper rents and royalties so they can benefit their people with health, education, et cetera, et cetera. That's where I see this going ultimately. Standing before the United Nations saying, this is what we need to do. And ultimately, it's going to happen because it's the right thing to do. And it's going to be necessary down the road.
I don't think I could guess what's going to happen in 100 years. But I know that the public, if they have the information and that they're not so overwhelmed with the economics of campaigns and the political process today, if they connect the performance and protection of the permanent fund to a dividend in a way that can't be changed, the connection is solid, then I believe they will protect the fund in, we can't judge for the future, but we can at least give them the opportunities we've had. The current generation of Alaskans, and it's hard to admit, but we're probably collectively the most spoiled constituency on the face of the earth, because we've been the beneficiaries of a huge amount of resource wealth. We have paid very little for the services we get. And if you spend your life shopping in the markets and the restaurants and everything else of all the world around us with no prices on the menu, you tend to spend too much. And we don't, the people of Alaska are the beneficiaries of that, and we're the creation of that. And we're exporting resource wealth at a tremendous rate, and we're taking that from our children and our grandchildren. And that part we should be ashamed of. We should be proud of the effort. We should work to continue it. We should work to get the connection back. But we're still very, very well taken care of.
Well, gentlemen, on that heady note, I want to thank you both very, very much for joining us today. We will certainly be doing our part at Commonwealth Canada to carry the torch for this vision here at home, and look forward to hearing about your success in defending the permanent fund in Alaska. If people want to follow your work, or if there are Alaskans listening today, how do they get involved? How should they follow you?
How do they get in touch with us?
Or get involved, or is there something they should be doing? Should they be writing their state rep?
Absolutely. Writing their state representatives with this very message, and educating every generation, starting with middle school, high school. They need to get this message out that the commons belongs to them, guys. It always has for the past 10,000 years. It only changed a couple hundred years ago.
Thank you both very much again. For those listening who are interested in following our work at Commonwealth Canada, to make something very similar to what's been discussed today a reality, I ask that you visit us at commonwealth.ca, sign up to our mailing list. You'll have all the information you need there. But one more time, Charles and Rick and Jack, thank you very, very much for coming here today.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity, Liam and Ken.
Thank you.